a moment of truth that will change history. They called it a unity summit. But Ibrahim Traore could smell the betrayal before he even crossed the threshold. When the president of Burkina Faso walked into that high-security conference room, he wasn't just defending his nation. He was walking straight into a coordinated trap, a military tribunal disguised as diplomacy, orchestrated to force his hand in the name of regional stability, but fueled by foreign agendas and offshore promises. The goal? Strip him of power. The method? Pretend to preserve peace. The risk? That Traore might not walk out. 7 African generals, stiff in their ceremonial uniforms, waited in silence. Not brothers in arms, gatekeepers of the status quo. They came from different nations but had one thing in common: loyalty to foreign financiers over African futures. Most had trained in Western academies, Sandhurst, West Point, École de Guerre. They saluted in French long before they spoke their own mother tongues. The room, blue-curtained, leather-scented, humming with air-conditioned menace, belonged to a luxurious estate in Dar es Salaam, the kind of place designed to muffle conscience. Traore's face was unreadable as he entered. The men stood one by one, stiff handshakes exchanged. Cold eyes behind polished smiles. General Kasanga of Congo pushed a leather-bound folder toward him with mechanical calm. No ceremony, no delay. Inside, an ultimatum. Traore was to resign within 30 days. In exchange, a peaceful transition, no sanctions, and a vague promise of regional harmony. But every line in that document dripped with the ink of foreign banks. "You've become inconvenient," muttered General Diarra of Senegal, not bothering to raise his eyes. Ibrahim Traore scanned the room. These weren't commanders anymore. They were middlemen, salesmen for silence. Behind the medals on their chests were contracts, silent deals made in air-conditioned offices in Paris, Brussels, and Washington. They had tried isolation. They had tried media campaigns. Now they were trying fear, packaged as unity. But they underestimated something crucial. Traore didn't come to negotiate. He came to expose. He placed the folder down, didn't flinch, didn't shout. His voice was low, yet it cut like a blade. "You ask me to surrender, not for peace, but so you can continue selling Africa in pieces, under new names." Some generals looked away, others stiffened. This wasn't a peace conference, this was a funeral. Mine, you hoped. "Let's begin the eulogy, shall we?" He slid the folder back across the table. His hands were bare. No notes, no aids, just truth. Africa is not poor. She is being looted, daily, in plain sight, with our consent. Gasps were stifled. The air thickened. Traore began naming names. Oil corporations in Chad, mining companies in Mali, uranium exports from Niger powering Europe, while African hospitals ran on candles. Gold from Burkina Faso dazzling Geneva, while women fetched muddy water from rusted pumps. "Do not call it aid when they take 10 and return 1, he said. "Do not call it partnership when they wear the suits and we carry the rifles." A hand trembled on a coffee cup. Another tapped against a polished table leg. But Traore wasn't done. "They do not fear our weapons. They fear our awakening. Because the day the African child learns she was never born broken, the empire begins to crack." He took a step closer. "You say I destabilize. No, gentlemen. Truth destabilizes lies. Dignity destabilizes dependency." He paused, then added with solemn weight, "You've confused your foreign pensions for peace." Nothing could hide them now. Not flags, not anthems, not titles. Everything lay bare under the weight of his words. It wasn't a speech, it was an indictment. "If I am to be removed," he said, "let it be in the open. But I will not die with your gold in my mouth." Silence thundered across the room. He stood still, gaze firm, hands unclenched. "You call me reckless?" he asked. "So was Sankara. So was Lumumba. Not because they failed, but because they dared. General Zola of Angola blinked. He had trained in Belgium. He knew the truth behind Lumumba's murder, but he had never spoken it. And in Traore's eyes, he saw something terrifying, not rebellion. "You cannot colonize a people who've remembered their worth," Traore said, voice now a whisper that somehow filled every corner of the room. "You can only delay them, distract them, divide them, but not forever." The room was still. The men who had once carried the weight of their nations now looked like relics, finely dressed, highly ranked, but politically hollow. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. The plan, so carefully choreographed, had unraveled. What was meant to be a quiet dismantling of a dissident had transformed into a generational reckoning. "For too long," Traore continued, "we've mistaken compromise for wisdom. But no wise man sells his home to rent a seat at another man's table." He stepped back from the table, his presence no longer one of resistance, but of emergence. The general who had come to face judgment was now issuing it. One of the aides discreetly adjusted a camera, ensuring every word continued streaming to networks far beyond the borders of that room. What the generals had hoped would be a private submission had turned into a live broadcast, a digital insurrection. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, from townships to universities, screens were glowing with his voice. "You don't need to agree with me," Traore said, eyes locked with General Kamba of Cameroon, "but you will remember that on this day, someone stood, not for applause, not for position, but for principle." He gestured to the blueprint folder still open on the table. The Gold Reserve System, the Pan-African R&D Coalition, the Youth Reconstruction Corps. Pages that didn't plead for permission. They announced a future. "This is not a rebellion," he said. "This is restoration. We are not burning down the house. We're kicking out the thieves who changed the locks." The room pulsed with an unspoken truth. The generals had expected a lamb. They got a lion. "And if I must fall for saying this," he added, "then let it be recorded. But let it also be remembered." I fell facing forward. At that moment, the door opened. Not abruptly, not forcefully. Just enough for a young officer in plain fatigues to step in, no ribbons, no medals, just the flag of Burkina Faso on his shoulder. He stood at attention behind Traore. "Sir," the officer said, "messages from the northern border. Locals have begun forming volunteer patrols. They say they're done waiting for outside help." Traore nodded once. The symbolism wasn't missed. The generals had tanks, advisors, press contacts. But he had people, awakening, organizing, reclaiming. He turned back to the room. "You want to know what power looks like?" he asked softly. "It's a mother in Kaya planting millet beside an abandoned French airstrip. It's a teenager in Ouagadougou repairing a solar panel with scrap wire. It's a soldier choosing to guard a school instead of a gold convoy. That is Africa. Not broken, not poor, just betrayed." The air had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. And maybe, just maybe, regret. General Bo from Ghana looked down at the proposal again, his lips pressed together as if swallowing a memory. A younger version of himself might have believed in this, might have fought for it. "We were told he would come alone," General Kamba whispered, "but he brought the whole continent." Traore gave a final glance around the room. Some eyes met his. Others fell. "What you do next," he said, "will decide your legacy. You can choose to remain gatekeepers of dependency or become architects of dignity. But make no mistake, the wind has changed, the drums have started, and no empire has ever stopped a rhythm once it reaches the villages." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. The aide fell in step behind him. No security, no entourage, just purpose. Behind them, the room remained frozen, a museum of what once was. And outside, the skies over Africa were still the same, open, vast, and waiting. The echo of Traore's final words had barely faded when the real storm began. That night, across Africa, something rare happened. The people stopped scrolling and started watching. Clips from the closed-door meeting began to circulate like wildfire, subtitled, translated, clipped, and quoted. Traore Speaks trended from Nairobi to Nouakchott. In classrooms, in barbershops, in crowded buses and markets, his voice played like a song no one had heard in years, but somehow remembered. We are not dying. We are in labor. It was not just a speech, it was a rupture. But in the corridors of global influence, panic wore a polished smile. In a sterile boardroom in Brussels, a representative from the EU's External Action Service tapped a pen furiously. "Who leaked this?" she demanded. In Washington, a quiet emergency meeting was called at Langley. Satellite images of Burkina Faso were reanalyzed. Keywords like resource nationalization, Pan-African alliance, and sovereignty threat spiked on internal dashboards. And in Paris, an aging diplomat simply muttered, "The ghost of Sankara walks again." Back in Ouagadougou, Traore returned not to cheers, but to preparation. He knew better than to mistake applause for security. His motorcade was smaller than usual, more civilian pickups than armored trucks. His advisors were tight-lipped. Some were already under pressure, a revoked visa here, a frozen asset there. But Traore had expected it. "Let them come," he told his interior minister. "The tree does not panic when the axe arrives. It watches which hand holds it." What he hadn't expected was what followed next. Days later, in a dusty outpost near Burkina Faso's eastern border, a drone strike obliterated a rebel camp, or so the media said. But no rebels had been there. Only a convoy of youth volunteers returning from a sanitation project. The strike was unclaimed. The equipment, Western-made. The narrative, immediate. Collateral damage in a war zone. Traore sat in his office, staring at the grainy footage from a recovered phone. "They've started the shadow war," whispered his intelligence chief. "They want to make us look unstable, to justify what comes next." Across the border, in Niger and Mali, whispers of coup plots stirred. Encrypted messages traced back to offshore servers. Old allies began receiving quiet visits from foreign envoys with veiled promises and quiet threats. Meanwhile, foreign media ran op-eds with headlines like Traore's vision, idealism, or instability. Burkina Faso's rising risk factor. When populism meets geopolitics in Africa. But the people weren't buying it. In Bamako, student unions screened the speech on campus walls. In Kinshasa, a graffiti mural appeared overnight. "We are not poor. We are plundered." In Accra, a retired colonel gave an impromptu speech on national radio. "I served the old guard, but I say this now. Traore is not a threat. He is a mirror. If we don't like what we see, we should change the reflection." Even the African Union, usually slow and soft-spoken, called for a special summit. Not in Addis Ababa, but in Dakar, a symbolic move westward. Behind the scenes, a quiet alliance was forming. Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, even whispers from Ethiopia. They weren't signing treaties, they were sharing documents, blueprints modeled after Traore's folder. And in every village where foreign flags had once flown over bases, locals began asking one simple question: why are they still here? But not all reactions were symbolic. One night, just past midnight, gunshots rang outside the presidential compound. 2 vehicles had tried to breach the perimeter posing as medical supply trucks. They didn't make it past the gate. "Test run," said the commander of Traore's guard. "They want to see how close they can get." That same week, Traore's cousin, a teacher in Bobo Dioulasso, was abducted for 2 days and released, shaken and silent. The message was clear. You speak, your family bleeds. But Traore didn't flinch. He addressed the nation the next morning, not from a studio, but standing in front of a damaged well in the northern province. If truth costs me my blood, let it flow. If silence costs us our freedom, let it break. We were born in a fight, and we will die standing. But as Africa stirred, another figure emerged, quiet, masked, and dangerous. A man known only by his codename, Spectre. A former mercenary turned CIA asset, now operating out of Ghana and Togo. His mission? Destabilize Burkina Faso's leadership using internal actors. His weapon? Information warfare, infiltration, psychological operations. He didn't plant bombs. He planted doubt, leaked fake memos, forged letters suggesting Traore was planning a life presidency, hacked into government communications, attempted to flip close allies. But Traore's inner circle was tighter than expected. And Spectre's real weakness? He underestimated one thing: the loyalty of a people who finally knew the truth. In Dakar, Senegal, the newly constructed Pan-African Unity Center stood like a jewel of ambition, its glass dome reflecting the morning sun, its halls filled with flags, suits, and silence. The extraordinary summit on African sovereignty had officially begun, but unity was the last thing in the air. What loomed was a confrontation between the old guard and the rising fire Traore had ignited across the continent. Ibrahim Traore arrived without fanfare. No heavy escort, no lavish convoy, only presence. His uniform was plain, green fatigues bearing only the insignia of Burkina Faso. He entered the summit chamber last, not late, but deliberate. A few leaders glanced his way with quiet disapproval, while others nodded in silent respect. He wasn't just a delegate. He was the storm they had hoped wouldn't come. Among the crowd, President Koumbi of Côte d'Ivoire sat rigidly in his seat, fingers folded around a speech he had rehearsed a dozen times. Prime Minister Langa of South Africa maintained his neutral smile. General Maputo of Mozambique leaned back warily, calculating. But it was Madame Jelani of Kenya, the youngest head of state in the room, who kept her eyes fixed on Traore, not with suspicion, but anticipation. Opening remarks echoed in diplomatic tones, talks of stability, regional cooperation, economic harmony. But everyone in that room knew the elephant wore camouflage. Then Koumbi stood, calm, polished, and clearly rehearsed. He denounced the rising tide of reckless populism, warned of anti-cooperative posturing, and without naming names, accused certain leaders of inciting division under the guise of sovereignty. All eyes turned toward Traore. But Traore didn't flinch. He rose from his seat and stepped forward into the center of the summit floor. He carried no papers, no prepared speech, just truth. He spoke plainly. They called his movement reckless because it didn't ask permission. They called it dangerous because it named names. He turned slowly, addressing the room with calm authority, saying that maybe the youth needed fire, because diplomacy had buried them in cold silence. He didn't stop there. He accused the old guard of fearing their own children, of fearing that silence was ending. He reminded them that when young Africans ask, "Why did you let them take our future?" they will point not to colonizers, but to their own leaders. The room held its breath as the youth observers behind the delegates stood and applauded, not politely, but with conviction. But not everyone was watching in admiration. In the shadows of the summit's security personnel stood a man in a gray suit, his eyes hidden behind dark glasses. His codename was Spectre, a Western-backed operator who had failed to destroy Traore with disinformation and now came to Dakar for something riskier, discrediting him on the world stage. Spectre passed a flash drive to one of Koumbi's aides. On it, a fabricated audio file suggesting Traore had made a secret deal with a foreign military power. But Traore wasn't unprotected. His aide, A cyber intelligence officer named Amaduka intercepted the file minutes before it could be uploaded. She traced it to a laptop tied to Kumbi's delegation. She handed Traore a folded note during the break. He read it once, then looked up at Kumbi with a slight nod. The trap had failed before it began. When the summit resumed, Kumbi rose again, this time accusing Traore of hidden agendas and suspicious foreign ties. Gasps rippled through the chamber, but Traore stood calmly, turned to the crowd, and asked if they'd like to hear the audio Kumbi had just received. He explained where it came from, who planted it, and how it was meant to destroy him. The silence that followed was no longer political, it was personal. Kumbi sat down, face pale, speech forgotten. Traore took the moment and spoke louder than any rebuttal. He told them that sovereignty isn't a slogan, it's survival. He reminded them that the foreign military bases across Africa weren't protecting schools, but minds. That the real threat wasn't rebellion, but awareness. And that once Africa awakens, no summit, no sanction, no foreign agent would be enough to put it back to sleep. By the end of the summit, the narrative had shifted. Several nations withdrew from long-standing foreign defense agreements. Others joined a newly proposed sovereignty bloc. Kenya's President Jelani called for a continent-wide audit of every contract involving foreign corporations. The African Union announced a task force, not on peacekeeping, but on self-determination. Traore hadn't just survived the summit, he had flipped it. What began as an ambush ended as a rallying cry, and though the cameras caught his exit, what they couldn't capture was the ripple spreading through the continent. In back rooms and barracks, in classrooms and villages, one thing became clear. Traore was no longer just a man. He was a movement. And for those still serving the old order, the question now wasn't how to stop him. It was whether they had the courage to join him before history left them behind. The weeks following the Dakar summit were electric. Across the continent, conversations once whispered in back rooms were now shouted in marketplaces. From Bamako to Banjul, young people recited Traore's words like scripture. Civil servants began to quietly resist exploitative policies. Journalists dug into old contracts, long buried under dust and diplomacy. Something had shifted, but not everyone celebrated. In Paris, Washington, and London, think tanks held emergency panels behind closed doors. In those rooms, the concern wasn't Traore's ideas. It was their reach. He had survived an ambush, reversed the narrative, and planted seeds of revolution. Worse, he had exposed the script. And now, the old hands needed a new tactic. They couldn't discredit him. They couldn't isolate him. But they could destabilize everything around him. It started in Niamey. A sudden explosion rocked a government depot. No casualties, but enough to spark panic. Anonymous sources blamed military mismanagement. Then came rumors of infighting in Ouagadougou's transitional council. The headlines screamed cracks in Traore's armor. But those on the inside knew the truth. Spectre had returned. The same shadow operative who had failed in Dakar was now playing a deeper game. His new weapon wasn't a bullet or a flash drive. It was doubt, engineered, distributed, and planted like landmines in loyalty. At first, Traore ignored the noise. He focused on his blueprint, rolling out gold reserves, partnering with African universities, and launching a Pan-African Youth Corps. But then, one of his closest allies, Colonel Issouf, vanished. 3 days later, Issouf resurfaced at a press conference in Accra, denouncing Traore as a dictator in the making. His statement was televised live on international channels. His tone was robotic. His eyes were hollow. Traore watched in silence. He didn't flinch. But something in his posture shifted. Issouf was compromised, whispered Amaduka, her voice low. Traore didn't answer. He simply stood and walked to the map pinned to his office wall. On it, small pins marked the growing number of sovereign-aligned states. He moved one pin from loyal to unknown. Meanwhile, in Kigali, something remarkable was happening. A group of university students, inspired by the Dakar speech, hacked into their Ministry of Energy's database and leaked years of foreign resource contracts. Within hours, Rwandan youth flooded the streets, not in chaos, but in coordinated protest. Their chant was simple: "We are not poor, we are plundered." The protests spread to Harare, then to Yaoundé. The spark was real, and it was spreading faster than any government could contain. But the twist came not from a foreign capital, but from within Burkina Faso itself. One quiet evening, as Traore prepared for a late-night strategy meeting, a familiar face entered the room: General Sow of Mali. They had faced each other in the sealed room weeks ago, but tonight, Sow was alone. He removed his hat. He looked older, tired. "I came to warn you," he said. "There's a vote. Within 48 hours. Some of the generals, even within your own advisory circle. They've been promised immunity and pensions if they remove you quietly. No bullets, no drama. Just a signature." Traore stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" General Sow hesitated, then looked him in the eye. "Because when you stood in that room, I remembered who I used to be." That night, Traore didn't sleep. He summoned no guards. He issued no emergency orders. Instead, he recorded a single message broadcast the next morning across Africa's airwaves. "If I fall by betrayal, let it be known. But know this: I am not the revolution. I am only the first drumbeat. You are the rhythm. You are the storm." The message went viral in minutes, and just like that, the betrayal that was meant to be silent became a test. When the vote came, something extraordinary happened. 3 generals abstained, 4 voted against. 1, the deciding vote, was General Sow. Traore remained. But he knew now the battlefield had changed. In the shadows, Spectre received the report. Failure, again. But this time he didn't retreat. He activated something else, something long prepared. A string of proxy militias, financed and dormant, began mobilizing near resource-rich regions. Destabilization was no longer subtle. It would be full-scale. Silent wars disguised as tribal conflict. Pipeline accidents. Protests turned violent by planted operatives. Traore's words had awakened a continent. Now they wanted to set it on fire. And yet, across that continent, people were ready. In the slums of Lagos, youth organizers began teaching self-governance. In the villages of Sierra Leone, farmers formed cooperatives independent of foreign-backed corporations. In the refugee camps of Sudan, elders told stories of Sankara and Lumumba, followed by one name now spoken with reverence: Traore. The story wasn't over. The enemy was evolving, but so was Africa. Its pulse was louder, its eyes were open, its spine straightening. And as clouds gathered once again over the heart of the continent, one truth stood firm: Africa must unite and stand tall like Ibrahim Traore. Drop a comment below: should African leaders stand tall like Ibrahim Traore to liberate Africans? Kindly subscribe to our channel for more updates.